This is video 4, but we are going to go backwards and actually look at lesson 6-5, which is conditions for parallelograms, special parallelograms. This is on page 418, and I just want to briefly look at this lesson. We are going to go over 2 theorems that are conditions for rectangles, and then we're going to look at 3 theorems on the next page that are conditions for rhombuses. This is really just building on what we learned in lesson 6-4. And y'all, I am very mistake prone today. This is probably the 3rd or 4th time that I have done this one video. So you may hear me correcting myself a lot and trying not to start over. So I apologize if that is the case. Let's look at the first theorem, which is a condition for rectangles. This is 6-5-1. It says if one angle of a parallelogram is a right angle, then the parallelogram is a rectangle. Now I want you to remember this one. I think you will need it in homework, maybe even on the test. But this is building on what we learned before in lesson 6-4 that said that if a parallelogram is a rectangle, then it was made up of 90-degree angles. This one is saying if we know that this shape is a parallelogram and we know that one angle is 90 degrees, then okay, see my mistake prone self, let the phone fall off of the mount. I am so sorry. I hope y'all get a good laugh out of me today because I'm kind of a mess. All right, let me restate that. So what this is telling us is that we know that if this shape is a parallelogram, and if we know that it has one, or maybe I could say at least one 90-degree angle, then we know that it is a rectangle. That is enough information. The fact that it's a parallelogram and has one 90-degree angle is enough information for us to know that it is a rectangle. Just rereading it, if one angle of a parallelogram is a right angle, then we know the parallelogram is a rectangle. So again, you're going to need that information. All right, the second one says, if the diagonals of a parallelogram are congruent, then the parallelogram is a rectangle. If the diagonals of the parallelogram are congruent, then we know it is a rectangle. So what we said in 6-4 is if this is a rectangle, then its diagonals are congruent. Now we're saying if we have a parallelogram and know that its diagonals are congruent, then that tells us that it's a rectangle. All right, so moving on to page 419, conditions for rhombuses. We have 3 of these, and I have the tea kettle going in the kitchen. It may start being very loud any minute, so I apologize if that happens while I'm talking. We will ignore it, and I will beg my son to turn it off. All right, so the first one is 6-5-3. If one pair of consecutive sides of a parallelogram are congruent, then the parallelogram is a rhombus. Let's look at this parallelogram. It's showing us that it's a parallelogram, and it tells us that if one pair of consecutive sides, or sides coming one right after the other or next to each other, are congruent, then knowing it's a parallelogram and seeing that it has one pair of congruent consecutive sides is enough information to tell us that this is a rhombus. Because if this is a parallelogram and these 2 sides are congruent, then these 2 are also going to have to be congruent. Just by the nature of this being a parallelogram, this parallel to this parallel to this, and these first 2 being congruent. So that's enough information. One set of consecutive congruent sides in a parallelogram tells us that it's a rhombus. All right, the second one, if the diagonals of a parallelogram are perpendicular, then the parallelogram is a rhombus. Okay, so in 6-4, we learned that if we know this is a rhombus, then we know that its diagonals are perpendicular. This is the converse. If we have a parallelogram and the diagonals of the parallelogram are perpendicular, then that information lets us know that this is a rhombus. And lastly, if one diagonal of a parallelogram bisects a pair of opposite angles, then the parallelogram is a rhombus. So let me read that one more time while you look at the diagram. if one diagonal, so we're not looking at both, we're just looking at one, bisects a pair of opposite angles, that means it's bisecting the angle on this end and bisecting the angle on this end into two congruent angles, then it is in fact, this shape is in fact a rhombus. So in 6-4, what we learned about a rhombus is that it has two diagonals that each bisect two sets, or sorry, a pair of opposite angles. This time we're only seeing one diagonal and seeing that it bisects a pair of opposite angles. So that, if we know that the shape is a parallelogram, that is enough information to tell us that it is also a rhombus. All right, so those are theorems that you just need to process and review. Come back to them over and over and over when you're doing your homework, because you will need some of that on the test. So as you study your theorems throughout Chapter 6 for the test, you're going to want to make sure that you include Lesson 6-5 in that, and that you understand these somewhat condensed versions of what we learned in Lesson 6-4. For example, the first one, 6-5-1 right here, that if we have a parallelogram and know just one angle is 90 degrees, that lets us know it's a rectangle. So that is going to be important. I can't stress that enough. Y'all make sure that you're very familiar with these. Keep coming back to them in homework, and you should be good to go on 6-6 homework now. You should have all the pieces of the puzzle. All right, that's it.